Welcome everybody! I hope you are having a good Hanukkah. And today we are going to be talking primarily about Hanukkah, but a little about this week's Parsha, Parshat Miketz. Parshat Miketz always comes Shabbat Parshat Hanukkah. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that might be. But we're going to start out by addressing, I think, the main fundamental question that has haunted Jewish parents for these many centuries and millennia, particularly in more recent years, which is the question of why is Hanukkah such a lame holiday? Because of course it is a very lame holiday, even if we don't admit that to our children. But I mean, let's just do a comparison, right? Compare and contrast, because Hanukkah comes out roughly the same time of year as Christmas. And so, of course, what we try and do is this full court press. Hanukkah is just as good. No, Hanukkah is even better. Oh, look, Hanukkah's 8 days. You get more presents. But the reality of it is, right, what do you have for Christmas? You basically have, a bearded Arctic toy maker on a flying chariot pulled by caribou who visits homes and gives out toys, and people go to the forest and or their local Walmart and chop down trees and decorate them with fairies and candles and all sorts of other things. And they have little lavish meals of, Christmas goose and Christmas pudding and turkey and all sorts of other wonderful things. And they sing, wide variety of carols and songs, and there's drinking and festivities galore. Beautiful. What do you have for Hanukkah? From a strict halachic perspective, let's forget about cultural Hanukkah. We'll get to there in a moment. From a strict halachic perspective, what do you have to do for Hanukkah?
Light a candle.
And make a bracha, right? You light a candle.
To advertise the miracle.
Right. You go to your window, you light a candle, you make a blessing, you're done. Right? Strict halachically, that is all you need to do. That is the entire holiday of Hanukkah from a halachic perspective.
Little extra prayer.
Sorry?
Little extra prayer.
Benching is a little bit longer, right? You put in Alanisim, right? There's a little Hallel, right? Okay, there's a couple of extra prayers, but I'm saying from a halachic perspective, right? There's very, very little you need to do for Hanukkah.
So the part about giving coins or money is gifts, that's not halakhic?
So there's a lot of cultural aspects, right? But even the cultural aspects, right? So they're much later. What are the cultural aspects of Hanukkah? Well, there's present giving, right? Does anybody think that might be a reaction to... So you have all sorts of different, explanations, interpretations. No, it's really because they used to give coins to the teachers at this time of year, and so from there it widened out to general all right, but it seems like it's a cultural reaction to gift giving in other cultures.
They didn't even give gifts in the past. It was Channukah gelt.
Right, so originally it was Channukah gelt, and Channukah gelt turns into presents really in the modern day. There really isn't, I don't think you really find any sources outside of extremely modern times talking about presents at all, but even Channukah gelt is a pretty modern thing. And from a...
What do you call modern? How did you determine that?
How
do you define modern in this case?
The age of modernity. So, post-Enlightenment, let's say, right? Last couple of hundred years.
Okay.
And what else do you have, right, from a culinary standpoint? What do you eat on Hanukkah?
Fried food.
All right, so you have maybe fried foods. So we'll see this, again, recent development. If you go back in time, that's not necessarily the case. We'll touch on that in a moment. But, right, okay, jelly donuts and, hash browns. Okay, that's very nice, but it's not a Christmas goose and pudding, right? It's really, it's like Hanukkah is really, has one hand tied behind its back. And there's a reason for that, and that's because, right, Chazal wanted Hanukkah to be a lame holiday. What do I mean by that? Well, do Chazal know how to throw a good party? Yeah. Absolutely! We know how to throw a great party, right? If you had to say, what's a great party holiday in Judaism, what would you say?
Pesach.
Pesach, right? So, okay, maybe Pesach.
Purim.
I think Purim would be a good example. If you wanted to go, it's less so today, maybe today, sort of, right? In ancient times, much more so. In the time of the Mikdash, what would you say?
Like
Sukkot, right? Nowadays you have Simchas Torah. In the times of the Mikdash, you had Simchat Beit HaShoeva, where you had juggling fire and all. Okay, so what are the general hallmarks, right? If you look at Jewish holidays, what are the general hallmarks? So think about the major Jewish holidays. Right? We're not talking about minor holidays. Right? We're not talking about like Tu B'Shvat or Lag BaOmer here, and we're not talking about fast days or days of mourning. No Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur. Major Jewish holidays. What do you have? Well, you have Shalosh Regalim, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. Sukkot may or may not be separate from Shmini Atzeres Simchat Torah, so 3, maybe 4. We'll toss in Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur. That's a fast day, but Rosh Hashanah for sure. We can toss in Shabbat, right? Shabbat is included in these festivals, and Chanukah and Purim. So, what do all of these holidays have in common in terms of their celebration, except for Chanukah? Big meal. Are you required to have a big meal? Shalosh Regalim, Shabbat, right? Purim. Do you have to have a big meal? Yeah. Absolutely. You're required to have a big meal. Chanukah? Not so much. What about drinking? Oh, it wouldn't be a holiday without drinking, right? On Shabbat, Yom Tov, are you supposed to drink? Kiddush, you're required. Kiddush, you have to have a drink, right? Pesach, you're supposed to have 4 cups of wine, right? How about Purim? Is there drinking on Purim?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of drinking on Purim too, right? What about Hanukkah? No, nothing, right? Singing songs, right? Zmirot, right? You have, Shabbat, Yom Tov. What about Hanukkah? I have a little dreidel, right? It's like it's very hard. It's very hard to really come up with, almost ironically. So nowadays, there's tons of Hanukkah songs, but if you look at like sort of traditional songs, like piyutim or ancient songs for almost every Chag, you have pretty ancient songs, and certainly hundreds of years old. Hanukkah, Ma'os Tzur is really about it. I'm sure there are songs that are just not really part of the popular culture. Almost all the popular culture songs we have are very recent, right? Last few decades, and perhaps the irony, I don't know whether this is a bitter irony or this is a delicious irony, is that most of the popular Hanukkah songs sung today are Jewish lyrics to non-Jewish songs, where we celebrate how the Jews were victorious over the Hellenists who wanted to assimilate them. Okay, right? It's an interesting thought. Tamar, yes, you had observation?
Mizmor Shir al Chanukah Habayit is it customary to say after lighting the candles?
So some people say that. Sfaradim also.
My father used to say it.
Yeah, Ashkenazim have a much more liberal attitude to Mizmor Shir Chanukah Habayit, and Sfaradim have it as a more Chanukah-oriented thing, as I understand it. But again, that's true, right? From Tehillim, it's not particularly it's not specifically for Hanukkah. It's much more ancient than Hanukkah is. But okay, yes, Chanukah Habayit, and we're actually going to touch on that. Unless you think I'm just being curmudgeonly here, right? These are not my innovations, right? Let's look at what the halacha has to say about Hanukkah, right? Source 1. I know where we want to start. One end.
May I have one?
Oh, before we get to source 1, yes, Arthur?
Just one
Sure, I can take all of it, not just one.
It's interesting, I think,
One.
the books that describe the holiday most are not part of the canon.
That is a very interesting point. That's a very important point, right? What are the books that go into the most detail about the Hanukkah story? Right, the book of Maccabees, right? Or there's actually many books of Maccabees, none of which are part of Tanakh, right? Some of which are part of various different Christian Bibles, right? Depending on your denomination, depends on which of the books are in or out. But there, for Judaism, for the classic canonization of the Tanakh, of the Kaf Daled books of Tanakh, right? The 24 books of Tanakh, Maccabees, not part of it. None of the books of Maccabees are in there.
One more.
Sure.
But hasn't the whole Christmas celebration thing has also evolved over the years? I mean, if you read Dickens, it wasn't quite what we see in the malls today.
So absolutely, and that's where a point that we are going to get back to in the beginning, right? Which is where all of this came from originally. But before we're going to do that, right? We have a while to go before we get down there, but we will certainly return to that, I think, very valid point, right? Lest anybody think I'm just being curmudgeonly here and that I'm unnecessarily hating on Hanukkah, right? Let's see what the rabbis, let's see what Chazal had to say about it. So let's start with source 1. Pick a side, please.
The festive meals that many have on the days of Hanukkah are not required, since they were not established as days of feasting and joy.
Okay, right. You want to have a festive meal? Beautiful, wonderful. Are you required to have a festive meal? No. And why not? Well, it's not a day of joy.
Why not?
That's a very good question. Why isn't it a day of joy? I think it's, a pretty happy day. We will get to that shortly. Okay? But you may say, wait, that's the Shulchan Aruch, right? That's the Shulchan Aruch. I'm not Sephardi, I'm Ashkenazi. I hold by the Ramah. As my Rebbe was fond of saying, right, everybody knows Ashkenazim hold like the Ramah, except when they don't. But, right, let's find out what the Ramah has to say. Source 2, Maurice, please. Hang on. Maurice, source 2.
And there are those who say there is a slight mitzvah to have festive meals, since that is when the altar was dedicated. And they are accustomed to singing songs of praise and thanksgiving, to turn the meal into a Suda mitzvah. There are those who say one should eat cheese on Hanukkah, for the miracle was done through milk, which Judith fed to the enemy commander.
Okay, so maybe there's a slight mitzvah, all right? I've never really, it's not the term you hear that often, right? Ksas mitzvah, right? A slight mitzvah, maybe. But
am I wrong in seeing a time warp with Judith, and does that harken back to Sisera?
No, I don't think that's Sisera.
Yeah.
I think that's Judith and Holofernes.
Okay.
But the stories are very much parallel. Yeah. I think that's true. We're not going to get into detail on that, but I think you're right about that. But, right, everybody knows on Hanukkah what you have. Not latkes, not sufganiyot, right? You have cheese. Okay? Right, like I said, many of the customs that we have for Hanukkah today are much more recent and in response to various other things, right? Another classic example is, right, when I talk about sort of Hanukkah being both lame and recent, right, what game does everybody play or associate with Hanukkah?
It's a dreidel.
Right, dreidel, right? You don't really, again, not a lot of cultural association. It's a little bit difficult to come up with a reason why dreidel is in any way associated with Hanukkah. All right, so we put Nun Gimel Hey Shin on it to sort of associate it with it. We say maybe that's the trick they used in order to fool people when they were learning Torah. Of course, we say the exact same thing on Lag Bomer about bows and arrows, right? And again, right, it seems like it's this other cultural construct which doesn't fit so easily into modern times, right? Spinning top as a game is wonderful when the main competition is like hoop and stick, right? Okay, that's fine. But kids today aren't playing with hoop and stick. Kids today are playing with like Xbox. And spinning top is not as fun as Xbox, all right? And it's pretty much an objective statement. So we run into these problems over and over again. Another classic example of Hanukkah being sort of what's going on here department is the Kriyat HaTorah, the laning for Hanukkah. What do we read on Hanukkah? Anybody know? Dedication, right. Beautiful, right? We have the dedication of the Mizbeach, of the altar, in the Torah, which is lovely, right? Chanukah, dedication, connection, beautiful, wonderful. What's the problem? Is it the most scintillating read in the world? Well, let's find out. Source 3, George.
And it came to pass on the day that Moshe had made an end of setting up the tabernacle, and had appointed it and sanctified it, and all
anointed
the furniture thereof, anointed it, and all the furniture thereof, and the altar, and all the vessels thereof, and had anointed them and sanctified them, that the princes of Israel, the heads of their fathers' houses, offered. These were the princes of the tribe. These are they that were over them that were numbered.
Okay, so all the princes are going to bring sacrifices. Let's find out what that was, right? Start out.
And he that presented his offering the first day was Nachshon, the son of Aminadab, of the tribe of Judah. And his offering was 1 silver dish. The weight thereof was 130 shekels, 1 silver basin of 70 shekels, after the shekel of the sanctuary, both of them full of fine flour mingled with oil for a meal offering. 1 golden pan of 10 shekels, full of incense, 1 young bullock, 1 ram, 1 he-lamb of the first year for a burnt offering, 1 male of the goats for a sin offering, and a sacrifice of peace offering, 2 oxen, 5 rams, 5 he-goats, 5 he-lambs of the first year. This was the offering of Hakshon, the son of Aminadab.
Okay, wonderful. So, right, we have a very detailed reckoning of the prince of Judah, right, Nachshon ben Aminadab, and the offering that he brings on the first day. What about the second day?
Same stuff.
Right, Netanel ben Suar from Yisachar brings an offering. What is it? The exact same thing. Third day, same thing. all the way down to the 12th day, Achira ben Einan, right from Naphtali. What does he bring? Same thing. And what do? We read each and every single one. So I think the fairly obvious question is, why on earth are we doing that? First of all, why is this the reading for Hanukkah, right? Why can't we do like what we do on Pesach and just jump around and have different days, right? Different readings for different days on various different dedications or various different miracles and all sorts of different. We can read about the menorah. We can read about all sorts of different things that relate to Hanukkah. Second of all, right? Kind of why does the Torah do this at all? Right? The Torah is not familiar with the concept of ditto. There's no reason why we need to go into all this detail 12 times in a row. We can figure it out.
Obviously, there is a reason because it's there.
So, okay, I think that's fair enough. So these are all things that we are going to bear in mind that are confusing questions to us about the nature of Hanukkah. Why do Chazal hamstring Hanukkah, right? Why is it such a minor celebration? Don't we have a requirement to have festive meals and to have Kiddushin to drink and to do all sorts of other things, right? Why isn't it established as days of joy and holidays? And, all the attendant things that come with that up to and including the reading of the Torah that we have for Hanukkah. So, in order to understand that, we need to understand, why do you celebrate Hanukkah at all? Right? What is the basis for the celebration of Hanukkah? So, if you were to ask, my son is 6 years old, he's in first grade, and you were to ask him, why do you celebrate Hanukkah? What do you think he would say?
To get presents.
Okay.
There's
So-
oil, the miracle.
The oil lasted.
Yeah, exactly, right? What happened? The Maccabees came into the temple, and they cleared it out, and they wanted to light the menorah, but what was the problem? There wasn't any pure oil, right? All the oil had been defiled. It didn't have a hechsher on it, right? Maybe it had a hechsher, but it wasn't a good enough hechsher on it. And they only found one little thing of oil with a good enough hechsher on it, but it was only enough to last one day because all the other oil was impure. And a wonderful miracle happened, and the oil lasted for 8 days. Oh, it's beautiful. It's a touching story. What's the problem? None of it makes any sense. None of it makes any sense at all. And I don't mean, right, how can one jar of oil last for 8 days? Nor am I talking about the sort of vaguely anti-Semitic overtones of why are the Jews celebrating this holiday? They got a really good deal on oil, right? That's the issue here is, right? The issue here is, let's say the Jews take back the temple, and sure enough, right, everything's been impurified, and you can't light the menorah. What do? You wait for a miracle?
You go make more oil.
Okay, so one possibility is go make more oil. How hard is it to make oil?
Hard enough it takes 8 days.
So the traditional answer is it takes 8 days to make olive oil. Has anybody here made olive oil? Right? How long do you think it takes to make olive oil? So you need to take olives and you need to press them. That's how it's now. Olives in the vicinity of the temple in Jerusalem. Do we think there's olive trees in the vicinity of the temple in Jerusalem?
Yes.
Yes. What made us think that there's a mountain next to it called the Mount of Olives, right? There's a reason why it's called the Mount of Olives because there's olives, right? Or there were olives, right? Olive trees are very common in ancient Israel. Why? For the same reason that what's common today? Outlets. Right? The exact same reason that there's light switches and outlets common in every home, there were olive trees that were common in ancient Israel and throughout the ancient world because that's how you had light. Right? Nowadays we think of olive oil as, excellent, right? It's a much healthier alternative to vegetable or canola oil. That is a very minor side effect of olive oil. Olive oil was used for lighting. Olive oil was used for lamps. That was your power source. So of course you had it all over. There were olive trees in abundance. There were olives in abundance. There were olive presses, right? It's not that hard to make olive oil. But, okay, let's put that aside, right? For whatever reason, it would take a while to make olive oil. Let's assume. Yes?
I have a question. When did Hanukkah historically started becoming celebrated as the holiday?
So it seems like it was celebrated all the way back from the time of the Maccabees. Right, to varying different degrees, but it was celebrated at the time of the Maccabees. It's hard to get too much detail on it because...
This would have been before Christmas and before...
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
Okay.
no, absolutely. like another reason why it's hard to get details on it is because, right, if you want to know all the details about, for example, Purim, and you turn to classical Jewish sources, right? You turn to the Torah, there is a book on Purim. You turn to the Talmud, what do you have? Masechet Megillah, right? Let's say you wanted to learn about Pesach. So you turn to the Torah, there's a whole long story all about Pesach. You turn to the Talmud and you have Masechet Pesachim, right? Etc., etc., etc. Rosh Hashanah, etc., etc. Let's say you want Chanukah, you go to the Torah, you have nothing. You go to the Talmud, what do you have? Masechet Chanukah, Masechet Menorah? No, you've got like a page and a half in Masechet Shabbat, where we happen to be talking about candles, because you've got to light candles for Shabbat. And we're like, by the way, since we're on the subject of candles, there's this thing called Hanukkah where you're supposed to light some candles. Right? Again, very curious, right? Why is there no Masechet Hanukkah, right? Even if you want to say, oh, it's a relatively minor holiday. So Purim is a relatively minor holiday. It's right, it's not in the Torah, it's D'Rabbanan. And yet, right, we have a whole Masechet Megillah. How do we sort of figure out ways of making it longer, right, when there aren't that many halachic details to discuss? You have lots and lots of Agadatas. You have lots and lots of very interesting, fascinating stories. Do you think we're short up for stories about Hanukkah, right? No, there's lots of amazing stories about Hanukkah, and yet there's no Masechet Hanukkah. There's no Masechet Menorah. Yes,
What
come
about
on.
the argument between Shammai and Hillel?
So we're going to get to that. And that's in Masechet Shabbat, right? That's in there. But, right, it's very short, right? It's a couple of lines. It's not an entire Masechet. Okay, so what other alternatives might we have? Let's say for whatever reason we couldn't make new oil. Are we stuck? Well, let's look at the halacha. Let's look at source 5. Arthur? I accidentally put source 4 in there by mistake. It's repeated in source 6, so we'll skip it for now. Source 5. This is from the Gemara in Masechet Zvachim.
The elders of the south held that those who make atonement, the Kohanim, are like those for whom atonement is made the people. If the people are all tamei made, those for whom the atonement is made people, if the people are all tamei made, those who seek atonement for them, the Kohanim, may also be tamei made.
Okay, so, right, some people's explanation is, no, you couldn't make new oil because people were tamei, right? The Maccabees were Kohanim, right? The leaders of the Maccabim themselves were Kohanim, and they were all tamei, so they couldn't make the oil because the oil would be tamei. That's not a good halachic answer. Why? Because the Gemara very explicitly says, look, if you fought a war, and lots of people are tamei mate because there's lots of dead people in war, then what happens? Okay, so it's fine. You can you can do acts of Kiddusha, you can do the acts of the Mikdash in a state of Tumah and an impure state, because the Kohanim act as representatives of the people. And if the people are all in a state of Tumah, then it's okay for the Kohanim to be in a state of Tumah. Not only that, but what does the Rambam explain? Source 6.
If the time when that sacrifice is to be offered arise, and the majority of the people offering it were impure due to contact with the human corpse, or the people at large were pure, but the priests offering it were impure due to contact with the human corpse, or both of these were pure, but the temple utensils were impure due to contact with the human corpse, the sacrifice should be offered in a state of impurity.
Okay, so if the people are impure, fine. If the Kohanim are impure, fine. If everybody's pure, but the vessels themselves are impure, fine. In other words, what should you have done with all of that impure oil? Used it. Right? There's no halachic problem of using impure oil when there's no alternative. Okay, so you might say, all right, that's fine, but it's not so nice to use impure oil, right? Now we've turned the miracle of Hanukkah from a necessity into a chumrah, but okay, fine, right? It's not so nice to use impure oil. We don't want to use impure oil, and all we have is this tiny cask of oil and this large amount of impure oil here on the side. Do we have any alternatives? Is there anything we can do? We want to use pure oil. What do we do? Well, let's look at source 7. Which is Rashi's commentary to Psachim, right? Daf Yud Zayin Amud Bet. Please? No, Sam?
Okay. Understand, if a person pours an impure liquid into a pure liquid, Each individual drop becomes nullified in pure liquid, and thus the entirety is eventually pure.
Okay, so what do? Right, you've got some pure liquid, you've got a big vat of impure liquid, let's say oil, you've got your little eyedropper, drip, drip, drip. You take your impure oil, drop by drop, drip it into your pure oil. Halachically, it is 100% pure oil. What do you wind up with? A huge vat of pure oil. So again, right, from a halachic perspective, we have no need for the miracle of Hanukkah, right? We have lots and lots of ways of celebrating and lighting the menorah without involving this miracle. So what is going on? Yes.
What's the significance of the 8 days before Hanukkah, before that event? Why does the oil need to burn 8 days?
Okay, so the traditional answer is because it took 8 days in order to get new oil. It's unclear why it would take 8 days to get new oil. Perhaps it has something to do with Tumah, right? Tamei Meit, you require 7 days as part of the purification ritual. The problem is, from halachic perspective, that doesn't seem to be true. But that's certainly the classic answer, right? You can come up with many, many other answers. One of the most answered questions in the history of Judaism is, why is Hanukkah 8 days? Now, usually that's, why is Hanukkah 8 days rather than 7 days? But in general, right, people publish books with nothing but hundreds of answers as to why Hanukkah is 8 days. But, right, overall, our general question is, right, from a larger perspective, what's going on with this miracle at all? So let's say, right, like I said, that was the answer that you would get if you asked, right, my 6-year-old son. But okay, let's say I'm not asking my 6-year-old son, right, let's say I'm asking a teenager, or even I'm asking you, right? If you were being interviewed for the news and they would say, look, we've got an audience full of non-Jews who have no idea what this Hanukkah is, you've got like a sentence to explain why you're celebrating this holiday. Why are you celebrating this holiday? What would you say?
Probably the same thing, because that's the only real explanation I ever got.
Okay, could be, but fair enough. Right? Anybody got anything else?
The other idea of the few being victorious over the many.
Beautiful, right? What happened? The Greeks came and attacked us, and we defended ourselves, and we defeated the Greeks, right? It's very similar in many ways to the American Revolution, right? They were these terrible, tyrannical British who were, treading on our liberties, and we drove them off, despite, despite our few numbers, and we emerged victorious, and we set up our independent nation, glorious and free, and et cetera, et cetera. Beautiful.
But how does it tie to 8 days?
So, first of all, how does it tie to 8 days? But also, right, we have a deeper problem with that, which is, I wouldn't necessarily say it's untrue, but it is very misleading. Let's put it that way. So what we're going to do is we are going to do a historically accurate, as best we can, Hanukkah. We're going to try and understand Hanukkah in historical context. And with that, we'll be able to return to some of our original questions, and hopefully they will make a lot more sense. So, what do we have? We have to start out in the year 587 BCE, right? What happens in 587 BCE? The Beit HaMikdash is destroyed by... First Beit HaMikdash, right? Destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. This is the end of independent Judea for a very long time. Now people are probably saying, what do you mean for a very long time, right? The exile wasn't that long. And it's true, the exile wasn't that long, right? In 538 BCE, King Koresh comes and puts forth a decree saying that the Babylonians' reign is over, right? Who has conquered the Babylonians? Not really conquered, it was more of a bloodless coup, but still, who's in charge now? Now you have the Persians, right? The Persians are in charge, and the Persians say, anyone who wants to go back to their land, they can go back, right? The Babylonians had a very cruel style, and they said the best way to retain power is to exile people from their lands and exile people from their gods and their religion, because that way people don't have anything to fight for anymore. And either they'll assimilate or they just won't care as much. And the Persians' view was, don't make people angry, right? Just let them do whatever they want. As long as they're not rebelling against you, it's fine. Do whatever you want. So Cyrus issues this edict saying everybody can go back where if you want to. This, by the way, this decree, we actually have it, right? You can go, I don't know if there's Israeli museums who have it. Certainly the British Museum, you can see a copy of Cyrus's decree telling people who were exiled by the Babylonians didn't just do this to the Jews, they did this to lots of nations. We, the Persian Empire, give you permission to go back to your lands, to rebuild your temples, etc., etc. It's all good with us as long as you're not rebelling against us, as long as you are showing appropriate homage to us, it's fine. So, of course, the vast, vast majority of Jews pick up and go back to Israel.
No.
Not so much, right? A very, very tiny minority of Jews pick up and go back to Israel. Why? Well, because
They've settled it.
decades have passed, and people speak the language, and they have jobs, and it's good. We have very good culture here in America, Babylonia. And so what happens, even though you have an independent state of Israel, right, it's not so easy to move to Israel, right? It's hard, right? The young people and the chalutzim and the dreamers, okay, so they go. Who primarily goes, by the way, to Israel?
Ezra and his father.
Right, if you had to call them by a class, right, what would you call them in a word, primarily?
Kohen and scribe.
Right, Kohanim and Leviim, right? Largely Kohanim, right? Why? Because Kohanim have a tremendous amount of status in Israel when the Mikdash is built. If you have a Kohen who's in exile, what's the Kohen's status? He gets the first aliyah and he gets the bench. That's really, really different from being the exalted one who everybody comes and brings their first fruit and the portions of their sacrifices
And their rashes.
I'm sorry?
And their rashes.
And yes, and their rashes, true, right? So what's going on is you have the Kohanim returning, not so many of the other Jews return, and there's a lot of back and forth about this. And you basically have a division between the communities in Bavel, in Babylonia, and the communities in Israel. But there is a community in Israel, and they do rebuild Beit HaMikdash. It is not particularly large or beautiful or glorious, but it does exist, and that's something. What happens? Right, hundreds of years go by, and the Persians are defeated by the Greeks. Beautiful. I'm sure everybody here has seen Zack Snyder's excellent documentary 300. Right, all about how the ancient Persians were like ninjas with smoke bombs and no? Okay, well, before he was busy ruining the DC Universe, bringing the DC Universe to the screen, there was this movie, 300, all about the Battle of Thermopylae, right, the great Pyrrhic victory of the Persians. It is should be taken with a grain of salt, a wife of Lot-sized grain of salt, but essentially, right, what happened was the Persians were battling the Greeks. There were basically 7,000 or so Greek soldiers who were guarding the pass. The king of the Spartans realized that their position had been given away and that they were going to be outflanked, so he sent most of the soldiers to retreat, and about 300 Spartans and around 1,000 other Greek soldiers held the pass for as long as they could. They were mostly wiped out, but it bought the Greeks enough time to be able to retreat to a safe position, and eventually, mostly the Greek navy did most of the hard work, and eventually the Persians were defeated. There were a couple of more wars between the Persians and the Greeks, but ultimately, the Greeks emerged victorious, and who marches through Judea on his way to conquering a huge part of the known world, or the Western world at the time? Alexander the Pretty Good, right? So, very good. Okay. Rabbi Menachem Leibtag, by the way, who also, much of this year is taken from various different classes that he's given, points out, right? So Alexander the Great is part of a family, right? There's a lot of kings who come belong to a family of the greats, right? Catherine the Great, and Peter the Great, and Alexander the Great, and there's lots of the greats. Okay, so what goes on? Prior to Alexander, right, was there an independent state of Judea?
No.
Not really, but what did exist under Cyrus and the people who followed him?
Right to worship.
There was, right, the Jews didn't own Judea, but if you can't own, you rent, right? So they rented Judea. What does that mean? Judea was a vassal state. What does that mean? You had a governor of Judea, you have Judea laws, you have Judean religion, but you're under the Persians in the sense that the major, most significant thing is You have to pay taxes. You got to pay your rent. And as long as you're paying your taxes to the Persians and you're not rebelling against them, you can basically do whatever you want. Now, 333 comes, right? Alexander the Great comes, and now the Greeks have taken over, and there is a major significant change for the Jewish people in that now they pay their taxes to a different landlord, right? Now they're paying their taxes to the Greeks instead of the Persians, but other than that, absolutely nothing of significance changes. Alexander dies, very young. What happens to the Greek Empire?
It's split up into three
Gets
parts.
split up into 3 parts, and Judea is under the Ptolemies, basically under Egypt. How does this affect the Jews?
Not much.
Now they pay their taxes to the Ptolemies. Okay. Right, there may have been some indignity in the sense that they were technically under Egyptian control, but still, it is what it is. Life moves on. What happens a few centuries later? You have Antiochus III. Antiochus III goes and conquers Judea from the Ptolemies. This affects the Jews how? Right? What does Antiochus do?
He gets the
Changes in
taxes.
Jerusalem.
Right, nothing changes. Right, Antiochus does the same thing that the Ptolemies did before him, and that the Greeks did before him, and the Persians did before him, which was run your religion, run your temple, do what you want, as long as you're paying me the proper taxes, as long as you're not rebelling against me, you can have your state, everything is fine.
The Syrian Greeks.
The Seleucids, exactly. The Syrian Greeks, the Seleucids, they are now in charge of Judea.
Just as long as we're being accurate, most Jews throughout this whole period did not live in Israel.
Right. The bigger Jewish community was in Babylon, was in Babylonia, was in
Spain and Carthage, all over.
Right, less at this point, less so in those areas. The most of it was what you would call today Syria, what we today would call even Iran. All right, in those areas, you have far, far more Jews, but there is a significant Jewish population in Israel. There is a fully functioning Mikdash. There is and by this point, right, you haven't gotten to Herod's temple yet. That's going to be a while off. But you have a larger and more functioning Beit HaMikdash. So, the Syrian, the leader of the Syrian Greeks, right? Wait, I thought, wasn't Antiochus a wicked, wicked man, right? I learned that in school. So, who's the wicked, wicked man? It's not Antiochus III, but rather Antiochus the IV. Now, by the way, everybody know why is he called Antiochus? Was it because like there's some like Seleucid princess who like, you know, or queen I should say, who gives birth to a baby, and she's like, oh, he's so adorable, I'll name him Antiochus. That's right. Why is he called Antiochus? Because his capital is in Antioch. Exactly. Right. His capital is in Antioch. He's called Antiochus. So what happens? Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, which I think literally means God incarnate, realizes that there is a problem because there has been an uneasy peace. I don't even want to call it a cold war or a hot peace, or I don't know what you want to call it, but there have been basically some battles and some skirmishes between the Greek empires, but a new player has come onto the scene who is big trouble for everybody. Who is the player who's on the scene who's big trouble for everybody? Rome. So Antiochus says, what do we have to do in order to fend off Rome? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to reunite the Greek Empire. And the second thing we need to do is we need to Hellenize people. That is because he realized that you have all of these people under your control, and how faithful and loyal are they to the Seleucids or to the Greeks at all? Not at all. Right? They don't care about the Greeks. If the Romans were to come in tomorrow, what would they say? We'll pay our taxes to Rome. Like, it makes no difference to us whatsoever. They don't have any skin in the game. If they are going to be able to withstand or even defeat Rome, they need to be unified, and they need people to be essentially Greek patriots. So what does he do? Right? Does he come into Judea and start issuing decrees and murdering people? Is that what he does? No, that's a terrible idea. Right? And Antiochus knows that's a terrible idea. He's not going to go around murdering people in order to make them patriotic, right? You know, for all the mockery about the British Navy back in the day, right? The beatings will continue until morale improves is generally not a good way of dealing with things, and leaders have known that for a very long time. So what does he do? In order to unify the empires, well, he realizes that the Ptolemies are very weak. So he's going to go down to Egypt to conquer the Ptolemies. And on the way down, he goes through Judea, because that's what Judea is. It's a corridor. And what does he do when he's in Judea? In order to Hellenize people, he doesn't issue vicious decrees. Quite the opposite. He appoints a Hellenistic-friendly high priest, because as part of being a vassal state meant your important people, such as your high priest or your governor, etc., were at the appointment of the governing body, right? In this case is Antiochus. So he appoints Menelaus, who's a very Hellenistic-friendly priest, and he starts building Greek Hellenistic structures such as gymnasia in Jerusalem. Now, that sounds fine, right? A gymnasium that's like a basketball court, maybe a swimming pool, right? Like every Jewish school has a gymnasium, right? You wouldn't send your kid there if it didn't have a gym. Okay, what's a gymnasium? Let's start with this. What does gymnasium literally mean?
They competed in the nude, right?
Yes, that is literally what it means. It means to compete in games or to exercise while naked. Why? Because gymnasiums serve two purposes, many purposes, but the main two purposes were, officially they were training for the Olympics and other games. The Olympics, what were they for? Like to show how good your nation was, so you could stand on the podium and be like, hey, our country is number one in windsurfing, right? What were the Olympics primarily? They were a devotional tool to the gods, right? It was an offering to the gods of sport. So, of course, it was done naked, because the Hellenists worshipped the human form. But because they were essentially bastions of Hellenism, what else happened at gymnasium? You didn't just have the physical exercises and competitions. You also had philosophizing, symposia. Symposia actually didn't. I'm using symposia in the modern term. The ancient term of symposia actually was more orgiastic in nature, but that's neither here nor there. What you have is the gymnasium is a bastion of Hellenism, right? Hellenistic thought, Hellenistic exercises, preparations for Hellenistic deities, and their holidays. Who really loves this? If you build a gymnasium, right, even today, under the modern term of gymnasium, who gets very excited?
Jews.
I'm sorry? Well, not the Jews. I think is a very broad term. I'm thinking more in terms of demographics, age demographics here.
Yeah.
Right, the kids. Right, kids. Right. If you had a choice between wrestling or basketball, whatever it may be, and sitting in base medrash, right? So I'm sure many kids are very frum and beautiful. Okay, but for a lot of kids, ooh, basketball, right? It's much more attractive than sitting and studying ancient texts. So, what happens? People start getting a little bit freaked out that there's all these youth who are going and being involved in all these Hellenistic activities. And you start having a schism within even the Jewish people. People are also not so happy about Menelaus because he's very Hellenistic and he wants to make sort of changes and update the various different of the practices that they have in the Mikdash. So you have sort of the traditionalist Jews who don't like these changes, and you have more secularistic type Jews who are more Hellenistic who love the idea of bringing in these changes. What happens, right? Antiochus has no plans to just come into Judea and stay there, right? What's his plan? He wants to go conquer the Ptolemies. Except he runs into a problem, right? He runs into a vicious opposing force consisting of one old man. Who is this one old man? Well, he is the ambassador from Rome. And as an ambassador from Rome, he has a suitably Roman name. His name is Gaius Popilius Laenas. And he approaches Antiochus' army armed with a stick. Now, the story I'm about to tell you comes from Roman historians, so you should take the story itself with a grain of salt, but the general idea of what happened is essentially correct. What happens is that Antiochus approaches, and the Roman ambassador says, Rome has allied itself with the Ptolemies, who are to remain independent. Rome realizes that Antiochus is trying to unify the old Roman Empire and in order to stand against Rome, and they like having these divisions. The more these divisions are, the weaker the Greek empires are, and the easier they will fall when Rome decides the time is ripe to attack. So they don't want unification. They say, we have allied ourselves with the Ptolemies, and I give you your choice. You can either turn around and go home, or you can advance forward, in which case you will be at war with Rome. And Antiochus says, I need some time to think about it, at which point the old man takes his stick and draws a circle around them, and he says, I will have your answer by the time you step out of the circle, because if you step out of the circle without giving me your answer, you will have declared war on Rome. And Antiochus realizes he does not have the strength to go to war with Rome at this time, and so he steps out of the circle backwards, and he takes his army, and he goes home. As you can imagine, on his way home, he is not in a good mood. His not good mood is made far worse when he gets to Judea and he gets to Jerusalem. And what has happened in Jerusalem? Well, word has spread that Antiochus has been defeated, and further word has spread that Antiochus has been killed. Now, this is not true, but the word that the Antiochus has been defeated and killed causes what, particularly amongst the traditionalist Jewish community? Great celebration. And what do? They kick out Menelaus from the temple, and they destroy, or at least they vandalize the gymnasium, and they basically say things are going to go back to the traditions that we've had for these many millennia or centuries. Antiochus finds out about this, and the combination of his defeat without firing a shot at essentially the hands of Rome, and the fact that people were rejoicing over his death, and all of his attempts at Hellenizing these Jews have completely fallen on deaf ears, causes him to become enraged. And what does he do? He lets loose his soldiers, who were spoiling for a fight anyway, and themselves were feeling, you can imagine, somewhat emasculated at their defeat. He lets them loose to ravage the city and destroy it. And they absolutely destroy the city. They murder tens of thousands of people. And Antiochus says, if you were not going to accept Hellenistic values when I gave them to you willingly, then you will take them by force. And at this point, he begins issuing the decrees for which he is famed in terms of, or infamous in terms of Channukah, against Brit Milah, against Shabbat, against teaching Torah, right? All of these decrees are made in order to force people into Hellenism.
Brit Milah.
Right. And why is Brit Milah such a big deal?
No, so it's Brit Milah, Shabbat.
And teaching Torah generally, right? Why is Brit Milah such a big deal, by the way?
Because when you're in a gymnasium with no clothes on,
right.
Exactly.
Right. What side you're
right.
on.
Yeah.
For the Greeks, right? The human body is the embodiment of beauty, and mutilating the human body is a terrible thing.
There was three things. There was Brit Milah.
And there's no way to hide it when you're in a gymnasium.
Was it kashrut also? Or was it...
I don't think there was. I'm not aware of any specific rules regarding kashrut. But, right, and what else do you have is you have enforcement of the Hellenistic gods. So what happens is the temple in Jerusalem is turned from a temple of God into a temple of Zeus.
Three things.
And right next to it, because he realizes, right, when you start messing with the Temple Mount, people are going to get angry. This is true thousands of years ago, not tremendous amounts have changed. So right next to the temple, what does he build? A garrison for troops called the Akra, and hundreds, perhaps even thousands of troops are there. And what do? They sort of send out sorties of soldiers and priests to go to the various towns where they instruct the people to go and worship the Greek god, or one of the Greek gods, whether it be Zeus or whatever it might be, until they get to the Maccabees, right? What happens? Right? What happens when they get to Modi'in? So, what do the people do? Right. So what do the people do when they're told to go worship the god of the Greeks or the gods of the Greeks? You have the Maccabim who take up arms and they attack, and the soldiers are really not expecting this because they're just in a town in the middle of nowhere, and really not ever since the massacre in Jerusalem, people have been in terror of the Seleucids and taken by surprise, right? The Greek soldiers and priests are killed, and immediately, in order to commemorate this victory, what do the Maccabim do? They hightail it because they are not idiots. And they know that what's going to happen if you kill the priests and a bunch of Greek soldiers? There's going to be more Greek soldiers. So they go and they hide out in the hills of Golfna for a year. What do they do during this time? They do two main things. I'm sorry?
They practice being soldiers.
Okay, in a way, that's true. They do,
types.
exactly. So they have basically guerrilla tactics, like small ambushes here and there. They're recruiting people, right? Faithful Jews are being recruited, right? What's the rallying cry of the Maccabim? 3 words. Mi Lashem Elai, right? Whoever is for God, come to me. And they would, it's loaded in a lot of different ways, right? And what they have is they set up an intelligence network, which becomes crucial because they're fighting a guerrilla warfare. If they don't know where the Greeks are, then they are in a lot of trouble. And if the Greeks know where they are, then they are in a lot of trouble. So their information network is vital. And after a year, right, they're ambushing the Greeks. They're finally ready for larger military operations, and basically the war begins. Yes?
Where is Rome at this specific period of time?
In Italy. No, I'm not sure.
What's wrong?
Because they scared Antiochus. Antiochus is going back home.
Right.
He's not really going back home.
So what they said is, right, you need to stay within your own borders.
Oh.
Judea is part of Antiochus's borders.
Okay.
We'll see what Rome does eventually,
No,
right?
yeah.
But at this point, right, you basically have a ragtag group of a few hundred Jews. What happens, right? So the Seleucids, what do they say? Okay, right, we need to defeat these Jews. So what do? Right, so they'll send 1,000 soldiers. And then they send 2,000 soldiers. And then they send 4,000 soldiers. And they say higher and higher ranking members of the military. Right? This is how the war goes. Unfortunately, for time reasons, we can't go into the tactics that get used. Suffice it to say, the Maccabim rely very heavily on guerrilla tactics and on their knowledge of the land. Right? They rely heavily on ambush techniques because what makes the Greeks so successful in war is their use of military formations. Right? Their use of phalanx, their use of rounded shields, their use of throwing spears and close combat weapons. If the Greeks get into formation, it is very, very difficult to defeat them, especially because they're trained soldiers. What do the Maccabim have? Right? They need to rely on the element of surprise because they can't let the Greeks get into form. So they have to ambush them along the way. This is where their use of military terrain comes in. Basically, what are the Greek advantages? Well, anybody want to take a stab at it? Right? What are the Greek advantages? Far superior numbers.
Training.
Far superior training and weapons. Absolutely, right? If you look at what it is that the Greeks have, right? The Greeks have at this point essentially they have far superior armor. They have far superior weaponry. What weapons do the Maccabim have? Whatever they got from the Greeks, right? That's why they're ambushing the Greeks, in order to take their weapons. What training do they have? They have very little training.
On the job.
Well,
What?
it's on the job.
Exactly.
training. Some of them probably became reasonably decent soldiers.
Some of them become excellent soldiers, right? And certainly excellent tacticians, because they're forced to. And in fact, in certain ways, their ignorance works to their advantage, because they understand they can't let the Greeks get into formation, but because they're not constrained by conventional military thought, they're also not constrained by sort of ideas of honor on the battlefield and facing your enemy, because that's suicide. right? What the advantages that the Maccabim have primarily is, what are the Greeks fighting for? If you're a Greek soldier, if you're a Seleucid soldier, what are you fighting for?
Money.
Basically money, right? You need to do your service, and after you do your service, you get a plot of land and you get to retire, and you get to have a wife and a family after your time is up. So you basically want to get through all this, and if you can get some booty out of it, right? If you can get some pillaging out of it, all the better. If you're the Maccabees, what are you fighting for?
The life.
Yeah, if you lose, you and everyone you know will be massacred, right? That is very significant. And it allows one of the main advantages that the phalanx had is not only that it's very difficult to assault, it's also that you have everybody fighting together. Why is it so dangerous to break soldiers apart into smaller groups? Because they will turn and run, right? It's much easier to be brave when you're in a large group. It's much harder to be brave when you see thousands of people coming at you and you're in a tiny group of a few dozen people. But very often that's the most effective technique, right? Someone needs to be the bait. And very often that was a technique that was used by the Maccabees. The problem is if you're a Greek soldier, right? Once the lines are broken, what are you very likely to do? Turn around and run. Because you want to survive this. You don't want to die in Judea, right? Hundreds of miles away from your family and home and, where you hope to retire to. And realistically, since you're fighting a bunch of ex-farmers living in the middle of the sticks in the hills, what are the odds that you're going to come into some treasure trove of great bounty, right? Very little.
They haven't adopted the Roman practice yet of decimation?
So the Greeks are certainly plenty cruel when they need to be, or when they want to be. But what they're not going to do is, so why don't the Greeks just come and kill everybody? Well, there's two reasons for that. First of all, a lot of the people they can't, because the point is, the people who they're after are the people who are hiding in the hills. The people who are hiding in the hills are the people who are the hardest to get at, or the hardest to get to, and the vast majority of time, what Judah Maccabee would do in leading his troops would be ambush the soldiers on their way to the waypoints, right? They wouldn't let them establish a position anywhere near the Maccabees. So they would get to Jerusalem, and anytime they left Jerusalem, their lives were in danger, and they knew it. The other issue was, in order to be able to, basically, two things. In order to Hellenize the people, you can't murder all of them. It also sends a bad message for everybody else, potentially. You could argue it's a good message to the other people, but if you want to get any money out of the area, right, how do you get money? In taxes. How do you get taxes? You take a portion of what the people earn. If there's nobody there to earn anything, then the land will just lie fallow, and you won't get any money. So you have a problem that keeps on perpetuating itself. What happens ultimately is that Judah Maccabee is successful enough, he's eventually killed after many, many successful battles, but the Maccabees are successful enough that, what do? They defeat the Greeks and drive them all home, and they decide to give up. They're like, oh, these Maccabees are too powerful for us. We can't defeat them. Let's just give up. Is that what happens?
No.
Not so much.
Capture Jerusalem.
Eventually, well, they do capture Jerusalem. They don't actually capture all of Jerusalem, right? They're able to recapture the temple, but they're not able to capture the Akra, which leads to a very tense situation in Jerusalem, where basically you have the temple here and you have a garrison of soldiers, of Greek soldiers, not very far away. But, right, what happens is, who steps in and says, all right, we see an opportunity here to further disempower the Greeks.
Rome.
The Romans step in. What happens? The Maccabees make a treaty with Rome. And that ultimately is what ends the war. Right? It takes about 20 years, but the Romans, recognizing the weakness of the Seleucids and the bravery of the Maccabees, and the fact that the Maccabees are actually in a position to win, form an alliance with the Maccabees, and they basically say, there's a non-aggression pact. The Seleucids realize that attacking the Maccabees further means attacking Rome, and they back off. What does that mean? Even from the beginning, the Maccabees' independent Judea was dependent on the Romans. And ultimately, when the Romans come and take over a couple of hundred years later, why? Do they come marching in with armies and banners blazing like the sun and destroy all the enemies in their wake? Why do the Roman soldiers wind up in Jerusalem? Because they are invited in. Right? What happens? There's internal infighting between various groups, and ultimately they call upon the Romans. One of the factions that has been defeated calls upon the Romans to help them and agrees to become a vassal state to Rome. And that's how Rome gets its foothold in Judea. That's further on down the line, but the point is that the Maccabees were indebted to Rome from the beginning, and ultimately, because of political infighting, invite the Romans in. Ultimately, Judea becomes a vassal state to Rome. Ultimately, because of rebellions against Rome, Rome comes and destroys the Beit HaMikdash, and there is no more independent Judea for 2,000 years. So, what does that leave us with? A huge honkin' problem. What is our huge honkin' problem? Well,
We didn't
we're
really win.
celebrating Hanukkah because the Maccabees won! Except
They didn't
they
win.
kinda didn't. Right? Even if you say the Maccabees defeated the Greeks and established an independent Judea, which is absolutely true, how long did that last?
Not long.
At most, a couple of hundred years. How long was Judea not independent after the defeat of the Maccabees? Right? 2,000 years. So the question becomes, how do you celebrate Hanukkah? It's saying we're celebrating that time that Judea was independent before, once again, we were defeated by our enemies. We're celebrating that time where we cleansed the Beit HaMikdash until the Beit HaMikdash was again burned to the ground.
What's wrong with that?
It's not the most joyous of occasions.
But it was then.
It was then, but the question is, how do we celebrate it now? I don't know for sure. I suspect if you went to the celebration of Hanukkah, right, 5 years after the Maccabees' victory, it would be a wild and crazy celebration.
It was good for 200 years.
But the problem is, for 2,000 years, it was much more problematic. So what happens? It's not, and again, it's not just problematic in the sense that why are we celebrating this, right? Ultimately, the regime got corrupted and destroyed. But also, what are you celebrating? Remember, the Jews are in exile now. What are you celebrating? Remember that time the Jews were under a foreign nation and rebelled against them and killed them and won? And established their independent state? Let's have a big celebration about that. And then all the nations will ask, well, why are you Jews celebrating this? Oh, we're celebrating the time that we didn't like our foreign overlords, and so we rebelled against them and killed them and established an independent state. Hooray! Right? So what happens, right? You have a minimization of Hanukkah. By the time of Chazal, by the time of Gemara, you don't have a Masechet Hanukkah telling the Romans how happy we are about that time we rebelled against the Greeks and defeated them. We don't have a Days of Awe and celebration. There's no big celebratory meal. What do you have? We light some candles. We light some candles. We light a menorah. Remember the miracle of the oil. So what's the deal with the miracle of the oil? So let's look at source 8 for understanding why we celebrate Hanukkah, and this hopefully we can tie everything together. Who are we up to?
Me.
Karen, okay. Source 8.
Said Rav Hanan bar Rabbah, calendar is kept on 8 days following the winter equinox. Saturnalia on 8 days preceding the equinox. As a mnemonic take the verse, thou hast beset me behind and before. Our rabbis taught, when Adam of old saw the day getting gradually shorter, he said, woe is me. Perhaps because I have sinned, the world around me is being darkened and returning to its state of chaos and confusion. This then is the kind of death to which I have been sentenced from heaven. So he began keeping an 8 days fast. But as he observed the winter equinox and noted the day getting increasingly longer, he said, this is the world's course, and he set forth to keep an 8 days festivity. In the following year, he appointed both as festivals. Now he fixed them for the sake of heaven,
but the idolaters appointed them for the sake of idolatry.
Okay, so what do we have, right? We have the Roman holiday of Saturnalia, or Calendra and Saturnalia, celebrating the winter solstice. I think it says equinox there. It shouldn't. Okay, it should be solstice. I apologize if it says equinox in there. Celebrating the winter solstice, and Chazal say, right, what's going on? This isn't a Roman invention. This is a very, very ancient tradition going all the way back to Adam HaRishon, when he fears, right, his world is going to be extinguished as a result of his sin. Right, after all, originally he was told if you eat from the tree you're going to die. So he figures, oh, this is what death is. And yet, then he sees that the days are getting longer, and he's not going to die, and everything is returning to normal, and he says, oh, this is just the way of the world. It becomes a big celebration, and at some point it becomes corrupted, and becomes this 8-day celebration of Saturnalia. This crazy 8-day celebration, where the Romans would go nuts and do all sorts of crazy, wild party. What happens, right,